Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack complex topics and, well, extract the most important insights for you. Today, we're diving into something that's really generating some intense buzz in global financial circles. It's a new and highly debated strategy known as the Pennsylvania Plan. Now, this isn't just another economic proposal tossed around. Analysts are actually hailing it as remarkably sophisticated, a potentially transformative approach, something that goes far beyond previous, maybe less effective attempts to tackle these persistent U.S. financial vulnerabilities.
Yeah, what's truly distinct here, I think, is how this plan sharpens the contrast with earlier concepts. Things like the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord, remember that?
Oh yeah, vaguely. That didn't go anywhere, did it?
Exactly. It was largely dismissed, right?
Right.
Seen as unworkable. Some observers even called it nonsense. But the Pennsylvania Plan, it feels fundamentally different. It's being considered a robust, almost an open maneuver,
No.
designed to be much harder to counter.
Interesting. And the news first broke, you said, from Deutsche Bank.
That's right.
And the name Pennsylvania Plan, it actually comes from the U.S. Treasury Department's location on Pennsylvania Avenue. Kind of fitting.
It is, yeah.
So our mission today for you listening is to really unpack this strategy. We need to understand its ambitious goals and explore its, well, profound global implications. Okay, let's really dig into the core of this plan then. At its heart, the Pennsylvania Plan aims to fundamentally re-engineer sort of the ownership structure of U.S. Treasury bonds. Now, while domestic investors currently hold the majority, foreign holdings have swelled. They've grown to a point where they're perceived as hurting U.S. financial independence.
Right.
So the explicit goal here is to reallocate almost all U.S. Treasury bond ownership from foreign hands back to domestic investors. And a pivotal mechanism for this huge shift, is the widespread promotion and use of dollar stablecoins. These are digital currencies designed to maintain a stable value, usually pegged one-to-one with the U.S. dollar, often backed by assets like Treasury bonds themselves.
And stepping back just to see the bigger picture here, this plan is really designed to confront what's seen as a critical double deficit for the U.S.
Double deficit.
It's not just the massive fiscal deficit. I mean, national debt is staggering, $37 trillion, according to some analysts?
Wow.
But it's also that persistent trade deficit. And this dual challenge, this combination, has resulted in the U.S. holding a severely negative net foreign asset position.
Which basically means very dependent on foreign money.
Exactly. Heavily reliant on foreign capital. And this deep reliance, in turn, is viewed by some commentators as fundamentally constraining U.S. sovereignty and independence. It limits policy options on the global stage.
Okay, and this next point you mentioned earlier, it really highlights a critical vulnerability the plan aims to fix. Just a few months back, April or May-ish, the U.S. reportedly experienced a sudden stop in capital inflows.
Yeah, that was significant.
Directly linked to trade tensions, right?
Right.
And it triggered what analysts called a triple kill.
A scary term.
Yeah. A simultaneous, significant drop in U.S. stocks, bonds, and the dollar.
Ouch.
And this crisis reportedly forced the U.S. government into making huge concessions on trade policy. It really revealed a profound fragility to these foreign capital flows.
Absolutely. And beyond that specific event, just general foreign demand for U.S. debt, it's been steadily declining anyway. Geopolitical shifts, ongoing deficits, it all adds up.
Okay, so that sets the stage. How precisely then does the Pennsylvania Plan propose to shift this, well, massive amount of debt back home and, strengthen the U.S.'s financial position in the process?
Well, the plan identifies the U.S. private sector, and we're talking large private banks, big corporations like Apple or Google, not really individual citizens here.
Like the big players.
Yeah, as having very robust balance sheets, substantial cash reserves. This private sector is seen as having this immense sort of untapped potential to absorb U.S. debt. So the core idea is pretty clever, actually, is for these U.S. private entities to acquire the foreign-held U.S. debt. And then they issue stablecoins, which would be collateralized, backed by this very debt they just bought.
Ah, I see.
It's described as a strategic transferring of ownership. The private sector effectively becomes the new holder.
Okay, but what's the strategic advantage? Why is it better for Apple or a big U.S. bank to hold this debt rather than, say, China or Japan?
Well, it fundamentally boils down to control and systemic stability. Unlike foreign debt holders like China or Japan you mentioned, who might be forced or feel compelled to sell U.S. debt during trade disputes.
Which causes instability.
Exactly. Causes currency fluctuations, financial losses potentially for the U.S. Domestic U.S. companies, though, they largely operate within the dollar system. They wouldn't have the same incentive or, frankly, the economic need to convert those dollars into foreign currencies on a massive scale.
Right, it stays in the system.
It stays in the system. It's about ensuring the capital remains within the U.S. financial ecosystem, like keeping the money within the family, or as one commentator vividly put it, preventing its escape, ensuring it remains captive. Closing the door to catch a dog was the phrase used.
Yeah, okay. But that sounds like a pretty significant ask for the private sector, even the big players.
Yeah.
Are there specific incentives or even mandates to get them to actually buy this debt?
Oh, absolutely. The plan outlines clear regulatory exemptions, things like easing supplemental leverage ratios for banks.
Okay, what does that mean in simple terms?
It essentially frees up capital they'd otherwise have to hold against their assets. So less capital tied up means more capacity to buy Treasury bonds.
Got it. Frees up money.
Exactly. And then there are significant tax incentives. For example, a company might get a substantial tax break, maybe pay only 10% tax instead of, say, 30% if they use their profits to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds.
Oh.
And then they can use those bonds, remember, to issue stablecoins.
So it's a double win for them, potentially.
Potentially, yes. And if incentives aren't enough, the plan also includes mandatory requirements.
The stick part.
The stick part, yeah. This could involve measures like pushing retirement plans to absorb more U.S. government debt or imposing stricter liquidity requirements on U.S. banks, insurance companies, basically forcing them to hold more U.S. Treasury bonds as collateral.
Okay, so a mix of encouragement and maybe some strong-arming. But what about the flip side? The potential internal costs, the drawbacks of such an ambitious strategy, especially for the U.S. economy itself.
Yeah, the sources definitely highlight several potential costs. These include potentially higher U.S. bond yields.
Meaning borrowing gets more expensive for the government.
Precisely. The U.S. government would have to pay more interest on its debt. There's also concern about an erosion of the Federal Reserve's policy independence.
How so?
Well, the Fed's actions might become more constrained by this whole new framework, potentially needing to accommodate the debt absorption strategy.
Right.
And ultimately, a really significant outcome that's expected from the strategy is a notable dollar depreciation, a weaker dollar.
A weaker dollar. Now, that sounds, well, counterintuitive for the U.S., right? Given its global financial power. Are the sources saying this is actually a deliberate aim? And if so, what are the benefits they see?
Yeah, it does sound counterintuitive, but the analysis suggests it aligns with a long-standing desire of past administrations, specifically mentioned as consistent with Trump's views, actually, from both his first and potential second term. A weak dollar.
Okay.
A weaker dollar is seen as having two main strategic benefits. First, it boosts U.S. exports, makes American goods and services cheaper, more competitive for foreign buyers.
Just get into economics, yeah.
Right. And secondly, it helps rebalance external deficits by effectively reducing the real cost of repaying that foreign-held debt. You pay it back with cheaper dollars.
Ah, okay. That makes sense.
And Deutsche Bank's analysis, cited in the sources, suggests that from a purely economic perspective, this outcome might not be a bad result, could even be good for the U.S. economy in the long run.
So this isn't some accidental side effect. It looks like a deliberate strategic choice with pretty significant implications for the U.S. economy and its global standing. Okay, so beyond just shifting the debt internally, there's this other really fascinating aspect you touched on, how these stablecoins are envisioned to extend U.S. financial influence globally, acting as a new form of soft power.
Exactly. This is where the strategic thinking really seems to unfold. The plan appears to recognize that certain entities, certain regions, they need access to dollar-based transactions, but they're currently cut off from the traditional financial system.
Like who?
Well, the primary beneficiaries that are often mentioned are entities. Precisely. These countries are restricted from using traditional dollars via SWIFT. Now, stablecoins, being theoretically decentralized or at least operating outside direct Fed regulation, they could potentially allow these regions to conduct dollar-based transactions outside the traditional banking system. This opens up opportunities for what's described, maybe a bit bluntly, as bottom feeding on undervalued assets in these countries, essentially allowing private investment, say in companies like China's BYD or DJI, for example, without the U.S. government having to publicly reverse its official sanction policies. It's a workaround.
A sort of deniable channel for dollar activity?
Kind of. And additionally, think about developing and underdeveloped nations with unstable currencies. Argentina is a classic example.
Sure.
Or countries in South America, ASEAN, North Africa. Many of these nations desire a sort of quasi-dollar circulation for stability, but maybe they've been denied full official dollarization due to U.S. geopolitical considerations. Stablecoins could provide a private sector alternative, fulfilling that need without direct U.S. government involvement or approval.
Wow, that really does sound like a new evolution of dollarization.
Yeah.
Is there a broader term for this phenomenon?
Yes, indeed. This leads to what the sources term pan-dollarization. That's the original source of global markets.
Pan-dollarization.
Yeah, it's not direct official dollarization managed by governments. It's more an expansion of dollar influence through these private stablecoins. The sources highlight that while currencies like the Hong Kong dollar or maybe even the Chinese yuan historically maintained links to the dollar, this new stablecoin approach offers a direct private sector alternative. It could potentially replace those older forms of linkage.
And this whole design is described as?
Highly sophisticated and ingenious are the words used. It's seen as a very intricate design.
Okay, it's clear how this plan might address U.S. financial vulnerabilities, maybe boost exports, extend influence. But how does the U.S. ultimately, profit from this? Or manage its massive debt burden through this global stablecoin adoption?
Right, that's a crucial question. How does the U.S. monetize its debt in this new world? One source frames U.S. debt itself, interestingly, as a form of pre-collected tax from the world, where the precise object of taxation remains, perhaps deliberately undefined.
A pre-collected tax,
But with the widespread emergence of these stablecoins, a new form of seigniorage tax is effectively created.
Seniors, that's the profit a government makes from issuing currency, right?
Exactly. And the stablecoin seigniorage could essentially become a kind of world tax.
Yeah.
Through this mechanism, the U.S. can effectively expand liquidity within its own borders, even as its debt is increasingly held domestically by its private sector. Anyone holding U.S. debt or using these dollar-backed stablecoins anywhere in the world would, in effect, be contributing to this tax, paying for the privilege of using a dollar-linked asset.
So that's how the U.S. aims to manage its vast debt, by essentially gaining revenue from the global use of its currency in this new stablecoin form.
That seems to be the idea. The strategy, as one commentator vividly put it, allows the U.S. to skin the cow twice.
Skin the cow twice? How?
Well, first, by strategically buying back that depreciated foreign-held debt using a weakened dollar, getting it cheaper.
Okay, that's the first skinning.
Right. And second, by leveraging the seigniorage, the profit from these globally used stablecoins to fund its operations and acquire foreign goods and services.
I see.
So this dual-pronged approach, it promises to resolve multiple issues at once, at least from the U.S. perspective. The external debt problem, the need for future economic expansion, maybe using stablecoins instead of just relying on traditional QE, central bank bond buying.
Right, a new tool.
The new tool, and boosting exports via that weaker dollar. The sources suggest it's designed quite ambitiously to solve all problems for the U.S.
Wow. Okay, if this plan really is as ingenious and impactful as it sounds for the U.S., how might other countries react? What vulnerabilities does this create for them?
Yeah, this plan undeniably creates significant vulnerabilities for other nations. That's a key point. Stablecoins, just by their nature, they can potentially bypass national regulations. That makes tax management difficult for other countries. And it could enable easy cross-border capital flight.
Capital flight, how easily?
Well, the sources mention an example how individuals might get around, say, China's annual $50,000 capital outflow limit by simply transferring potentially billions via a USB drive holding stablecoins. It becomes much harder to track and control.
That's quite a loophole.
It is. And this is seen by some critics, particularly outside the U.S., as a way for the U.S. to suck others' blood, essentially attracting capital away from other economies, perhaps destabilizing them.
Okay. And beyond capital flight,
There are also these broader concerns that stablecoins could multiply market liquidity beyond the direct control of national central banks. They lose some control over their own money supply.
So loss of monetary control, too.
Potentially, yeah. Former PBOC Governor Zhu Xiaochuan, he's the former head of China's central bank, a major figure. He specifically cautioned about U.S. stablecoins and their potential to deepen global dollarization, pushing it beyond traditional financial oversight.
So the alarm bells are ringing elsewhere.
Definitely. And in response to this perceived assertive U.S. strategy, other major economic powers are actively developing their own countermeasures. It's not happening in a vacuum.
Like what?
Well, Europe is focusing on the rapid development of a digital euro.
Right, the CBDC project.
Exactly. China is similarly advancing its digital yuan, the ECNY. They've been piloting that for a while.
Okay.
And there's another perspective mentioned from commentator Som Hongbing, who even advocates for something quite different. A return to a gold standard, or perhaps creating gold-backed stablecoins.
Gold back as a direct counter.
As a direct alternative or counter to dollar stablecoins, yeah. The argument emphasizes national credit and the inherent historical value of gold as a potentially more stable foundation than fiat currency backing.
Interesting. So it certainly suggests that while the U.S. is making its move, maybe preparing to make its move, other nations are keenly aware. They're actively seeking ways to protect their own financial sovereignty and influence in this evolving global landscape. You know, this whole deep dive into financial innovation, these geopolitical power shifts, trade strategies. Yeah. It really underscores how historical patterns of global order often seem to repeat themselves, doesn't it? Offers fascinating parallels to what we're seeing today.
It really does. And to truly grasp the profound implications of financial innovation and geopolitical power shifts across history, if listeners want to go deeper, we highly recommend A History of China by Hui Wang. It's available on Amazon, ebook, and paperback. It's really a central reading, I think, for this kind of context. It offers just invaluable insights into how financial strategies, trade dynamics, power struggles, how they've repeatedly reshaped the global order over centuries. And you can find fascinating parallels between historical Chinese approaches and some of these contemporary Western financial maneuvers we've been discussing.
Great recommendation. So as we've unpacked today, the Pennsylvania Plan.
Yeah.
Whether you see it as a reliable strategy or maybe more of an open maneuver, it clearly represents a highly sophisticated, potentially transformative shift in global finance, far surpassing, it seems, any previous attempts.
It really does seem like an ingenious design, as the sources put it, and many seem to believe it's completely workable and will be quite difficult for other nations to effectively counter. So as the U.S. moves or prepares to move to implement this ambitious plan, the world is definitely watching closely, watching for those counter strategies, maybe unintended consequences too. And this raises an important question, I think, for you, the listener, to consider. How will the global financial landscape continue to evolve as nations devise their own creative solutions? Solutions to navigate this a new era of, well, financial competition, maybe even financial warfare. What unexpected innovations might emerge next?
A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope this exploration has given you a fresh perspective on the complex and, frankly, fast-moving forces shaping our financial future.